A police officer walks into a restaurant and guns down her partner in cold blood. But the real shock? She wasn't done yet. She circled back, with her badge still on, ready to wipe out the last witnesses. And what drove her to kill? That's the most disturbing part of all. Welcome to Death Row Diaries, where we dig deep into the darkest corners of justice. Every week, we unravel the shocking stories behind America's most notorious inmates awaiting execution. If you're fascinated by the minds that break, betray, and brutalize, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a new case. Now, let's dive into the story of Antoinette Frank, a cop who crossed the thin blue line and left a trail of blood behind her. This is not just a murder case, it's a betrayal of trust, a failure of the system, and one of the most chilling cases in Louisiana's criminal history. When Antoinette Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in early 1993, she seemed, on the surface, like exactly what the department needed. Young, driven, and a top graduate of her academy class, Frank fit the image of progress in a city desperate for change. New Orleans was plagued with corruption, racial tension, and a crumbling police force. The NOPD needed officers badly. So badly, in fact, that they ignored glaring red flags. Frank had failed 2 psychiatric evaluations. One of the doctors, Dr. Philip Scuria, explicitly warned the department not to hire her. She lied on her application. She lacked basic emotional resilience, decisiveness, and confidence under pressure. But none of that mattered. The city was bleeding out officers faster than it could replace them. Salaries were pitiful, morale was lower than ever, and the push to diversify the force in a majority black city gave Frank an extra edge. So, on February 7th, 1993, Antoinette Frank was sworn in as an officer of the law. 3 weeks later, she graduated from the academy. From day one, her behavior was strange. Officers described her as shy, detached, and socially awkward, but there was something else, something hard to put into words, a coldness, a vacancy. One fellow officer later admitted she didn't know how to be a cop. Not really. She wasn't cut out for it. Supervisors tried to help. They suggested remedial training, extra oversight. She even earned a couple of community service awards that seemed more like PR than praise. But no one could have predicted what was coming. If you're already hooked and want to help support stories like this, drop a like and share this video. It helps more than you know. November 25th, 1994. Frank was on duty when she responded to a shooting victim, Rogers Lacaze, a young, smooth-talking drug dealer bleeding in the street. Most officers would have seen a suspect. Frank saw something else. Some say she wanted to save him. Others say she was just mesmerized. Whatever the reason, that night began a relationship that would spiral into chaos. At first, she claimed she was just trying to help him, to turn his life around. But soon, things got murky. She was seen letting Lacaze drive her personal car. Worse, he was spotted inside her squad car at a crime scene. She introduced him as her trainee, her nephew, or simply waved off the questions. But behind closed doors, things turned intimate. Frank and Lacaze were lovers, deep in a secret romance that had disaster written all over it. Frank ignored every risk, her job, her badge, her fellow officers. She knew who Lacaze was. She knew he dealt drugs. She knew he had been shot and possibly killed before, but she didn't care. In fact, some witnesses claimed the two began robbing people together, pulling over motorists in uniform, using her authority to steal. There was even an incident in February 1995, just a month before the murders, that should have raised alarms. Witnesses say Frank and Lacaze pulled over two men after a party, and during a violent altercation, Lacaze pulled a gun, a Tech-9. One of the men tried to flee. Another man, a civil sheriff, happened upon the scene. What he saw disturbed him. Frank in uniform, watching as Lacaze waved a weapon. But instead of stopping him, Frank vouched for him. Lacaze is the good guy. Let that sink in. A uniformed officer defending a known criminal with a gun mid-crime. The incident was never formally investigated. No charges, no reprimand, nothing. And less than a month later, 3 people would be dead. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. These cases only get darker, and Antoinette Frank's story is just beginning. It was a restaurant she knew well. Frank worked off-duty at Kim An, a quiet Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East. The Vu family, hard-working, tight-knit, had come to trust her. They'd let her in at all hours. She had a key. She was part of their circle, or so they thought. March 4th, 1995. Just after midnight, the restaurant was closed and the staff was cleaning up. Frank had already stopped by twice that night with Lacaze to grab some leftover food. It seemed harmless, but Chow Vu, the family's daughter, felt something was off. Frank's energy was different. When she returned a third time, this time alone, Chow knew something was wrong. Chow rushed to hide the restaurant's cash in a microwave. Frank entered using her stolen key and moved quickly, pushing Chow, her brother Kwok, and another worker into the kitchen. Officer Ronald A. Williams II, Frank's colleague and fellow security guard that night, watched the scene unfold and tried to follow. But before he could reach the kitchen, Lacaze emerged behind him and fired a bullet into his neck. Williams dropped instantly, paralyzed. Then came the second shot, then the third. He was executed point blank. Frank turned back toward the dining area. The massacre had only begun. In the chaos, Chow and Kwok dragged the other worker into the back cooler. They shut off the light. Silence. Hiding in darkness, they listened. What they heard next was pure horror. Frank and Lacaze was yelling at the Vu siblings, Ha and Kwong, demanding to know where the money was. But neither of them knew where Chow had hidden it. Frank pistol-whipped Kwong. Still no answer. She opened the microwave, found the cash, and then she executed Ha with 3 bullets. Kwong was shot 6 times. He died instantly. And then they left. But Chow and Kwok were still alive. Trapped in a freezer, they tried desperately to call 911, but couldn't get a signal. Eventually, Kwok slipped out and ran to a neighbor's house. The call was made, and that's when the nightmare turned surreal. Antoinette Frank was no longer at the scene. She had dropped Lacaze off and disappeared into the night. But when she heard the 911 call over her portable police radio, officer down at Kim An restaurant, she made her move. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she borrowed a police car and returned to the scene, posing as a responding officer in full uniform with her badge, armed. Her goal? Kill the remaining witnesses, eliminate Chow and Kwok. But fate had other plans. As she entered through the back door, Chow was at the front, waiting for help. When Frank emerged, Chow bolted toward the arriving officers, screaming, "You saw what happened! You killed my brother and sister!" Frank tried to play it off. She claimed she had no idea what was going on. She even pretended to investigate, acting like just another cop on the case. But it was over. The survivors knew what they saw. The mask had slipped. Frank was arrested on the spot. Lacaze was picked up hours later. The evidence? Overwhelming. The motive? Revenge, greed, chaos. We're only halfway through this shocking case. If you want to see how Antoinette Frank's trial became one of the fastest death sentences in New Orleans history, and how she may now escape execution, while the city reeled from the triple homicide and detectives locked up Frank and Lacaze, another grim secret was quietly waiting, buried just beneath the surface. Literally. Back in 1993, nearly 2 years before the Kim On murders, Antoinette Frank had filed a missing person report. The missing man, her father, Adam Frank. She claimed he'd vanished without a trace after staying at her home for a short period. The case never made headlines, no searches, no follow-ups. Just another lost person in a chaotic city. But the real horror emerged after she was already sitting on death row. In November 1995, a month after Frank was sentenced to die, a neighbor's dog began scratching obsessively beneath her house. Police investigated and found a human skull with a bullet hole in the back. It had been buried in the dirt under her foundation. Investigators suspected the skull belonged to Adam Frank. DNA testing was never publicly completed, but everyone from homicide detectives to prosecutors believed the truth was clear. Antoinette Frank had murdered her own father before she killed her fellow officer and the Vu siblings. Why? Well, here's where things get even darker. Frank had confided to psychologists and jailhouse interviews that her father had raped her repeatedly during her childhood. He was abusive, controlling, a monster in his own right, and Frank, they believed, had eventually snapped. She didn't just kill the man who abused her. She buried him right beneath her feet and told no one. And the state? They never even bothered to prosecute her for it. As one officer put it, "What's the point? She's already on death row." But death wasn't coming for her anytime soon. Not yet. Because what came next was a trial that shocked even the most hardened courtroom veterans. The case against Rogers Lacaze moved fast. In July 1995, just 4 months after the murders, Lacaze was found guilty and sentenced to death. His biggest mistake, he used Officer Williams' credit card at a gas station minutes after the killings. But Antoinette Frank's trial, that was something else entirely. Her legal team subpoenaed 39 witnesses. How many did they actually call? 0. It was as if her defense team gave up before it even began. The trial lasted a week. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivors took the stand. Witnesses tied her to the murder weapon. Her confession, though later challenged, was detailed and damning. And the jury? They didn't even need a lunch break. 22 minutes. That's all it took to return a guilty verdict on all counts. It was a New Orleans record for a capital murder case. The next day, they deliberated the sentence. It took just 45 minutes to recommend the death penalty. Even the judge looked stunned. On October 20th, 1995, Antoinette Frank was officially sentenced to die by lethal injection. She was transferred to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she would remain the only woman on the state's death row. Homicide detective Eddie Rance, who led the investigation, later said, "She's the coldest person I've ever met, and I've been doing this for 30 years. If stories like this leave you speechless, consider leaving a comment below. Should trauma excuse a killer's actions? Was justice truly served? We want to hear your thoughts. You'd think the story ends there, but it didn't. Because in America, death row isn't just a sentence, it's a long, brutal waiting game. Frank's attorneys launched appeal after appeal, arguing she had been denied funding for expert witnesses and was suffering from PTSD and childhood trauma. Psychiatrists testified that Frank had endured years of abuse and neglect, that her mind was fractured, and she wasn't inherently evil, but tragically broken. Others disagreed. A state psychiatrist diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial tendencies, traits common in sociopaths. In his opinion, Frank wasn't a traumatized victim. She was a cold-blooded manipulator. Despite these arguments, her execution was delayed multiple times. Death warrants were signed and revoked. Judges were recused. Questions about forged signatures and shady courtroom practices surfaced. And then came the twist. Politics. In 2023, Louisiana Governor John Edwards announced his opposition to the death penalty and advocated for its abolition. Sensing an opportunity, 56 of the 57 inmates on Louisiana's death row, including Frank, petitioned for clemency. The state parole board, however, wasn't interested. They rejected every single one. Antoinette Frank's clemency plea was denied in October 2023. But just when it seemed all hope had gone, everything changed again. In 2025, Louisiana introduced a new execution method, nitrogen hypoxia, and in March they carried out their first execution in 15 years. But Frank wasn't on the list. She still had one card to play. On April 28, 2025, her lawyers filed a new motion to overturn her death sentence, and this time the court listened. On May 15, 2025, a judge officially accepted her appeal and scheduled a new sentencing hearing for December 2025. For the first time in 30 years, Antoinette Frank has a real chance to escape execution. The state attorney general tried to intervene. The judge said no. So now, the woman who wore a badge, took innocent lives, buried secrets under her house, and became Louisiana's most infamous female killer, may never be executed at all. Antoinette Frank's story is more than just murder. It's about the failure of systems, policing, justice, trauma, and trust. It's about how a city ignored red flags, and how the line between protector and predator was crossed in the most brutal way imaginable. What do you think? Should her sentence be overturned, or is justice long overdue? Drop your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories from Death Row Diaries.
What if the man serving your country was hiding a secret so monstrous it would leave even seasoned investigators shaken? What if the uniform that symbolized honor, courage, and duty was worn by a predator who used that very disguise to carry out unspeakable acts? This is the story of Ronald A. Gray, a U.S. Army specialist stationed at Fort Bragg. On the surface, he looked like the kind of soldier America could be proud of. But behind that clean-cut image was something far more sinister. A cold-blooded serial predator who turned military grounds into his hunting ground. Welcome back to Death Row Diaries. We dive deep into the lives, crimes, and legacies of America's most infamous death row inmates. If you're drawn to true crime cases the mainstream avoids, twisted tales the system would rather bury, hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Ronald Adrian Gray didn't look like a killer. Born in Miami, Florida in 1965, his early life wasn't particularly unusual. He wasn't a standout student. He didn't come from privilege. He was just another kid trying to survive a rough neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and discipline was hard-earned. At 18, he joined the U.S. Army, a place that offered structure, direction, and a future. By the time he was 21, Gray was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, one of the largest military installations in the world. He held the rank of Specialist, E4, and worked as a cook, a quiet role, out of the spotlight, a man who followed orders, a man who blended in. But those who knew him casually say there was something off. He wasn't warm. He didn't joke around much. He kept to himself, avoided forming close relationships, and had a distant, flat affect. Still, no one suspected him of anything remotely dangerous. And maybe that's what made him so terrifying. There were no red flags, no warning signs, just silence, followed by screams no one ever expected to hear. Behind closed doors, Gray had begun nurturing dark desires. He was following women, sometimes from bus stops, sometimes from parking lots. He was watching, learning, and eventually, he acted. The first confirmed assault happened in April 1986. A young woman walking home alone near Fort Bragg was attacked, dragged into the woods, and violently raped. She survived, but barely. Her injuries were extensive. Her description of the attacker was terrifyingly specific. She said he wore combat boots and had military-issued clothing. He used military knots to tie her up. Whoever did this knew how to neutralize a target. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was controlled, cold, and deliberate. Then it happened again and again. Over the next 10 months, the Fayetteville area was gripped by fear. Women were being stalked, raped, and in some cases left for dead. The attacks weren't random. They followed a pattern. Young, alone, vulnerable. Each one a potential kill. The authorities were under pressure. Residents feared there was a serial predator on the loose, but there was no suspect, no fingerprints, no DNA matches, just whispers. And some of those whispers were pointing toward the military. Investigators started quietly checking soldiers stationed at Fort Bragg, but the Army was resistant. Some believed that drawing attention to a potential predator in uniform would damage the base's reputation. So the investigation stalled, and Ronald Gray kept hunting. Then came Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, a fellow soldier at Fort Bragg. She was just 18 years old, young, bright, full of potential. On December 11, 1986, she didn't show up for duty. Her friends grew concerned. Calls went unanswered. By the next day, her body was found dumped in a wooded area just outside the base. She had been raped and brutally stabbed multiple times. Authorities noted that her body showed signs of being posed. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, and the message was terrifyingly clear. The killer wasn't afraid. He was escalating. Military police were now forced to take the threat seriously, but once again the case hit a wall. No solid leads, no arrest, and another young woman paid the price for their delay. Here's where it gets darker. When Gray's name first surfaced as a person of interest, there wasn't enough to hold him. He denied everything. He was quiet, respectful, cooperative. But behind closed doors, he was planning another attack, and this one would be the most horrifying yet. What do you think went wrong with this investigation? Could the military have stopped him sooner? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We're reading all of them. On January 6, 1987, Ronald Gray ordered a cab. The driver was 23-year-old Kimberly Ann Ruggles. She picked him up as scheduled. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She didn't know this ride would be her last. A few hours later, her body was discovered in a remote area. She had been raped, gagged, stabbed multiple times, and left in the woods. This time, however, Gray made a crucial mistake. He kept her car keys and was seen driving her cab shortly after the murder. When police pulled him over, they found bloodstains, a knife, and Ruggles' keys in his possession. Game over. Ronald Gray was arrested that day. His calm demeanor cracked. During interrogation, he eventually confessed not just to Ruggles' murder, but to multiple rapes, assaults, and the murder of Private Vickery. He admitted everything with chilling detachment. No remorse, no emotion, just facts. And the facts were horrifying. Investigators now believed Gray was connected to at least 4 murders and 8 rapes, many of them on or near military grounds. But the nightmare didn't end with his arrest. What came next was a legal roller coaster that would stretch across 3 decades, involve both civilian and military courts, and raise uncomfortable questions about how far institutions will go to protect their image. If you've made it this far, you know this story is far from over. Hit that like button to support more deep dive content, and don't forget to subscribe.
When investigators started digging deeper into Ronald Gray's background, they uncovered a horrifying pattern, one that had gone undetected for months. Gray wasn't just committing random acts of violence. He was stalking his victims, planning the attacks, and executing them with a level of precision that left even seasoned detectives disturbed. He knew their routines. He waited for the perfect moment, when they were alone, vulnerable, and least expecting it. He didn't just assault them, he dominated them, physically and psychologically, often leaving behind a scene so gruesome investigators could barely process what they were seeing. And now that he was in custody, Gray started talking. In a cold, matter-of-fact tone, he confessed to raping multiple women, some of whom were fellow service members. He admitted to murdering Private Vickery Clay and Kimberly Ruggles, offering graphic details that matched the evidence. But even more shocking were the entries found in his personal journals, dark, detailed accounts of his thoughts and fantasies, some of which eerily mirrored the real-life crimes. It wasn't just depravity, it was premeditated, organized, and methodical. This wasn't a man who lost control. This was a man who thrived in control. He even admitted to returning to crime scenes, watching investigators work, and feeling a twisted satisfaction knowing they had no idea it was him. For investigators, it was clear. Ronald Gray wasn't just dangerous, he was the embodiment of evil, cloaked in a uniform meant to represent service and sacrifice. And now, the justice system had to decide how to respond. If this case is blowing your mind, let us know by dropping a skull emoji in the comments. We're building a community that refuses to look away when the truth is too dark for the mainstream. With such overwhelming evidence, the legal system moved quickly, but Gray's case was unlike most because it had to go through 2 separate trials, one in civilian court and one in military court-martial. In 1987, Gray was first tried in North Carolina civilian court for the rape and attempted murder of 2 women who survived his attacks. He was found guilty and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Most criminals would have faded into a prison cell for life at that point. But Gray's crimes had extended far beyond state lines. They touched the U.S. Army. So in 1988, Gray faced a rare military court-martial for the murders of Private Vickery Clay and Kimberly Ruggles, as well as additional rapes and assaults. This trial was even more damning. Military prosecutors presented DNA evidence, testimony from survivors, Gray's own confessions, and those dark, disturbing journal entries. There was no question. Ronald Gray had used his position in the Army to hide in plain sight and commit some of the most sadistic crimes ever seen on a military base. The military panel didn't hesitate. Gray was found guilty and sentenced to death, one of the only military death sentences handed down since the 1950s. But even then, his story was far from over, because the U.S. military hasn't executed a prisoner since 1961, and Ronald Gray was about to test just how far the system would go to carry out a sentence that many believed would never happen. If you think the military should have acted faster, or that Gray should have been executed already, hit that like button so this story reaches more people. Let's get the truth out there. After his death sentence in 1988, Ronald Gray was transferred to death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the only military prison where death row inmates are held. But rather than preparing for execution, Gray began a decades-long legal battle to stay alive. He filed appeal after appeal, first in military court, then in federal court. His lawyers argued that his confessions had been coerced, that he had ineffective counsel, that his mental health had been ignored. Some appeals were rejected outright, others dragged on for years. Then, in a stunning move, President George W. Bush approved Gray's execution in July 2008, the first time a U.S. president had signed a military death warrant since 1957. It looked like Gray's time had finally run out. But within days, his attorneys filed a new appeal, claiming due process violations. A federal judge issued a stay of execution just before Gray was set to die. The process repeated itself for years. Stays, motions, appeals, reversals, and long stretches of silence. As of 2025, Ronald Gray is still alive, the longest-serving inmate on military death row, and the military has still not carried out his sentence. So why the delay? Some believe the answer lies in politics. The military is under intense scrutiny for its handling of sexual assault and internal crime. Executing a black soldier, especially after decades of legal limbo, could create backlash. Others believe the system is simply broken, bogged down in bureaucracy and terrified of making a legal misstep. And then there are those who think Gray is being kept alive as a symbol, a warning to others, but not an example the military is ready to make. Whatever the reason, justice has been delayed. And for many, that's the same as justice denied. What do you think? Is Ronald Gray being protected by a broken system, or is this just what due process looks like at the highest levels? Comment your take below and share this video if you think it deserves attention. Today, Ronald Gray sits in a maximum security cell. He's 60 years old, and every day that passes, his name becomes a footnote, a quiet reminder of a case too inconvenient to resolve. For the families of his victims, the delay is an open wound. They've waited for 35 years for justice. Many have died waiting. Others have stopped believing it will ever come. But the legacy of Ronald Gray's crimes reaches far beyond just one man. It reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the military justice system, that even when the crimes are proven, the confessions are clear, and the sentence is signed by a president, the machine still grinds to a halt. What's worse is how little this story is talked about today. Gray is rarely mentioned in headlines. His case isn't brought up in political debates. It's almost as if the system wants him forgotten, buried behind concrete, steel, and decades of silence. But we're not going to forget, because justice, no matter how delayed, deserves to be seen, and the victims deserve to be remembered. Ronald Gray isn't just a murderer. He's a case study in how the uniform can become a disguise, how institutions can fail the people they're supposed to protect, and how even in the face of overwhelming guilt, a predator can stay alive through sheer legal inertia. And maybe that's the real horror of this story. Not just what Gray did, but what everyone else didn't do.
He had everything: a brilliant mind, a beautiful wife, 2 perfect daughters, and a son on the way. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a Green Beret. But in the dead of night, he called for help, whispering into the phone, "Stabbing! Help! 544 Castle Drive." When authorities arrived, they walked into a scene out of a horror film. His pregnant wife was butchered, his children stabbed and beaten beyond recognition, and above the bed, in blood-red letters, one word: pig. He claimed a drug-crazed cult broke in chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." But the blood, the fibers, the silence of the night told a different story. This is the twisted, tangled tale of Jeffrey MacDonald, the man who became the center of one of the most litigated murder cases in American history. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. If you're into true crime that doesn't sugarcoat the horror, subscribe and hit the bell. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the blood, before the headlines, to the man everyone once believed had it all. Before he was a suspect, before the media storm, Jeffrey MacDonald was what every parent wanted their son to be. Born in 1943 in Queens, New York, MacDonald was the second of 3 children in a working-class family. His father was strict, driven, a man who believed in discipline and excellence, and Jeffrey delivered, big time. By high school, he was the golden boy, student council president, prom king, voted most popular and most likely to succeed. He was sharp, confident, charismatic, the kind of guy people didn't just admire, they followed. That's also where he met her, Colette Stevenson. He was smitten from day one. She was shy, gentle, with a quiet kind of beauty that made you lean in rather than stare. Their first date? A movie called A Summer Place. Later, he'd say the theme song reminded them both of falling in love. Every time it played, he said, we'd turn the volume up. But teenage love rarely lasts. After a summer breakup, MacDonald moved on, dated other girls, even earned a full scholarship to Princeton. Still, fate had other plans. He and Colette reconnected while she was at Skidmore College. This time, things moved fast. When Colette became pregnant in 1963, they decided to marry. He was 19, she was just 20. MacDonald, now a husband and soon-to-be father, balanced the rigors of Princeton with part-time jobs. After graduation, he got into Northwestern Medical School in Chicago. By the time he was 28, he had a degree, a wife, a daughter named Kimberly, and a second child, Kristen, on the way. He completed a grueling internship in thoracic surgery, barely sleeping, often working 36-hour shifts. By all accounts, Colette handled the home, the kids, and the emotional weight of being the anchor for a man constantly in motion.
And then MacDonald made a decision that would change everything. He joined the Army. But this wasn't just any assignment. He volunteered for the elite Special Forces, the Green Berets. On paper, he was unstoppable. A doctor, a soldier, a family man. But what no one could see was how deeply those three roles would clash and what would happen when the pressure finally cracked the surface. The MacDonalds were assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina in 1969. They lived in military housing on Castle Drive. It was peaceful, safe, heavily patrolled by military police. The family settled into a neat routine. Neighbors described Jeffrey and Colette as friendly, attractive, even enviable. They were expecting their third child, a son. To celebrate, MacDonald surprised his daughters with a Christmas gift that felt straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, a Shetland pony named Trooper. He didn't even tell Colette, just took them to the stable on Christmas morning. Colette, in a letter to an old college friend, described her life as normal and happy. She said their baby boy was due in July and their family would soon be complete. It all seemed perfect. But those closest to them noticed things weren't as rosy as they appeared. Colette had dreams of finishing college and becoming an English teacher, but she remained mostly at home. Friends described her as increasingly reserved, often overwhelmed, maybe even isolated. Behind closed doors, things were tense. There were arguments. And then there was Jeff's other life. At the hospital, Jeffrey MacDonald was charming, flirtatious. He was known to have affairs. Colette may not have known every detail, but she wasn't blind. Their marriage, though publicly intact, was quietly fraying. Still, to the outside world, they were the American dream, wholesome, disciplined, untouchable. But in less than 2 months, that dream would turn into a waking nightmare. It was 3:42 a.m., February 17th, 1970. A chilling call came into the Fort Bragg dispatch. "Help! 544, Castle Drive! Stabbing! Stabbing! Hurry!" Military police raced to the address.
The front door was locked. The house was dark. But around back, the screen door was open. The back door, wide open. Inside, they found a scene straight from hell. In the master bedroom, 26-year-old Colette lay dead on the floor. Her arms were broken, her face beaten. She had been stabbed 37 times, 16 times with a knife, 21 with an ice pick. Her trachea was slashed. A pajama top, Jeffrey's, was draped across her chest. The word pig was written in blood on the headboard. Next to her, Jeffrey MacDonald, still alive, lay face down, one arm over her neck. He whispered, "Check my kids. I heard my kids crying." Then came the most horrifying discovery of all. In her bed, 5-year-old Kimberly lay on her side. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed in the neck. The force of the blows had cracked her skull so violently, her cheekbone protruded through her skin. In the next room, 2-year-old Kristen, still holding a baby bottle, was found stabbed 48 times. 2 of the knife wounds had pierced her tiny heart. It was brutal, senseless, beyond comprehension. MacDonald was taken to the hospital. His injuries? Minimal by comparison. A collapsed lung, a few cuts, some bruises. He stayed 9 days and walked out alive.
His story, however, would set off a storm that still rages decades later. According to Jeffrey MacDonald, he wasn't the killer. He was the victim. He claimed he had fallen asleep on the couch that night because his daughter Kristen had wet his side of the bed. Rather than wake Colette, he grabbed a blanket and crashed on the sofa. Sometime after 2 a.m., he heard screaming. Jeff, help! Why are they doing this to me?" He jumped up and saw 4 intruders. 3 men, 1 woman. The woman had long blonde hair, knee-high boots, and a floppy white hat. She held a candle and chanted, "Acid is groovy, till the pigs." He said one of the men was black, the others white. The shorter white male wore surgical gloves. They attacked him, stabbed him, clubbed him. He fought back, using his pajama top to block the ice pick, but they overpowered him and knocked him out. When he came to, the intruders were gone. He staggered into the bedrooms, tried CPR on each of his daughters, pulled a knife from Colette's chest. Then he called for help. That was his story, and if it sounded strangely familiar, like something pulled straight from the headlines, it's because it was. Just months earlier, the country had been rocked by the Manson family murders. Words written in blood, a beautiful wife dead, children killed, a cult of acid heads attacking innocents in the night. To some, MacDonald's story sounded like it belonged in a Hollywood screenplay. To Army investigators, it sounded like a lie. From the moment investigators stepped into the MacDonald home, something felt off. Yes, the scene was bloody, brutal, but chaotic? Not really. The living room where MacDonald claimed to have fought off 3 men was mostly intact. A coffee table had tipped over, but it had landed neatly on a stack of magazines, almost too neatly. A flower pot had spilled, but the pot itself stood upright. This wasn't the wreckage of a wild struggle. This looked staged. And then came the forensics. Each member of the MacDonald family had a different blood type, a rare stroke of luck for investigators trying to piece together who had been where. Here's what they found. No blood from MacDonald in the living room where he claimed to be attacked. His pajama fibers, supposedly torn off in that fight, were not in the living room at all. Instead, those fibers were found under Colette's body, in Kimberly's room, and even under Kristen's fingernail. How could that be, unless MacDonald was in those rooms with the girls after the shirt had been torn? And the murder weapons, a knife, an ice pick, and a bloody piece of wood, were found just outside the back door. All 3 came from inside the house. There was no forced entry, no wet footprints, even though it had been raining. Just one bloody bare footprint, MacDonald's, leading away from Kristen's bed. A glove tip was also found near the word pig written on the bed's headboard. It matched surgical gloves that MacDonald kept in the kitchen. Colette's blood found in Kristen's room. Why would it be there unless Colette had tried to protect her daughter? And what about MacDonald's injuries? He had a single stab wound, 5/8 of an inch deep. A mild concussion, some bruises and scratches. Nothing that required stitches, nothing that lined up with a life-and-death struggle against 3 attackers. Forensic analysts even recreated the crime scene by folding MacDonald's pajama top just like the one draped over Colette's chest. They discovered that all 48 holes could have been made by 21 stabs, all while the shirt was stationary, not being waved around in a fight, not torn during an ambush. It looked like the shirt had been laid on Colette's body after death and stabbed through to simulate a frenzy. The story was crumbling, and behind the story, they began to see the man. So why would a respected doctor, a Green Beret, a husband and father, kill his entire family? That's what everyone wanted to know. The prosecution didn't claim MacDonald was a monster by nature. They said he was a man under pressure. He was juggling a demanding military career, marriage, 2 kids, with a third on the way, and a side life filled with extramarital affairs and ego. He liked being the admired doctor, the flirt, the charming ladies' man. But Colette was catching on. She had written letters to friends that painted a mixed picture, one of happiness, but also hints of struggle. She felt like a mother of 2 already, and almost a third. There were whispers that Colette had confronted him about his infidelity, and that night something may have snapped. Investigators believe there was an argument, possibly about a wet bed, possibly about another woman. They think Colette hit him with a hairbrush, and MacDonald, trained in combat, hit her back hard. They say he beat her with a piece of wood, a slat from his daughter's bed frame, and killed her. Then Kimberly walked in. She was bludgeoned too, possibly by accident at first, but then stabbed. MacDonald, realizing he had just murdered his wife and daughter, couldn't stop there. He went to Kristen's room. Colette, still barely alive, may have tried to shield her daughter and was stabbed again. Then investigators say he staged the scene, wrote pig on the bed, stabbed Colette's body through the pajama top, disposed of the weapons just outside the house, stabbed himself with a scalpel once in the bathroom, then called for help. If true, it wasn't a premeditated act. It was a moment of rage followed by a calculated cover-up. A lie that almost worked. For a while, MacDonald walked free. In 1970, an Army hearing dropped the charges, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. He got an honorable discharge and moved to California, where he started over, working in ERs, giving lectures, dating a flight attendant. He even went on the Dick Cavett show, joking about the case, calling the Army's investigation a joke. To many viewers, his tone was flippant, arrogant, cold. And for one man, it was the final straw. Alfred Kassab, Colette's stepfather, had always supported Jeffrey. He testified in his defense, stood by his side. But watching that interview, something clicked. Kassab requested the full transcript of the Army's Article 32 hearing. What he read made his stomach turn. Lies, inconsistencies, physical evidence that didn't match MacDonald's claims. And then, the final blow. Kassab learned that just weeks after the murders, Jeffrey had started dating a young woman from Fort Bragg. Kassab turned on him, hard. He began a relentless campaign, contacting Congress, the DOJ, and the media. It took years, but in 1975, a grand jury indicted MacDonald on 3 counts of murder. He was arrested. He fought every step, but this time the trial would be civilian, not military, and it would change everything. The trial began in July 1979 in Raleigh, North Carolina. The prosecution laid out the forensic puzzle piece by piece. MacDonald's story, they argued, was a fantasy, a cover-up inspired by the Manson murders and pulled from a copy of Esquire magazine found in his living room. The defense leaned on character, a loving father, a war hero, a doctor. But the facts didn't lie. They brought in an FBI forensic expert who demonstrated how the ice pick holes in the pajama top could only have occurred if the shirt was stationary, not used in a struggle. They reenacted the supposed fight. The holes didn't match. And perhaps most damning of all, they played MacDonald's taped interviews with Army investigators from 1970. Jurors heard him sound emotionless, cold, defensive. On August 29, 1979, the verdict came in. Guilty of second-degree murder for Colette and Kimberly. Guilty of first-degree murder for Kristen. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. As the verdict was read, 4 jurors cried. MacDonald didn't shed a tear. But even after his conviction, the story didn't end. MacDonald continued to fight the verdict, filing appeal after appeal. In the 1980s, he was briefly released when a court ruled his right to a speedy trial had been violated. But in 1982, the Supreme Court reversed that decision. He went back to prison, this time for good. Over the years, new evidence emerged. Helena Stokely, a drug user who matched the description of the woman MacDonald claimed had attacked them, confessed, then recanted, over and over. Her story was never consistent. DNA testing in the 2000s found no intruder's DNA at the crime scene, just MacDonald's. Today, Jeffrey MacDonald is in his 80s, still behind bars, still claiming innocence. What if you were sentenced to death, only to be completely cleared, and then decades later dragged back into court, this time by the U.S. military, and condemned again for the exact same crime? That's not the plot of a legal thriller. It's the true story of Timothy Hennis, a man caught between life and death, innocence and guilt, freedom and the relentless grip of a justice system that refused to let go. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about the dark power of loopholes, the evolution of forensic science, and one man's journey through 3 trials for the same brutal crime, each with a completely different ending. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. If you're into shocking trials, twisted killers, and courtroom chaos, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what comes next. Fayetteville, North Carolina, May 1985. To outsiders, the Eastburns looked like your typical all-American military family. Captain Gary Eastburn, an officer in the U.S. Air Force, was away in Alabama for advanced training. His wife, Katie Eastburn, a 31-year-old mother of 3, was holding down the fort at home with their daughters, Kara, age 5, Erin, age 3, and little Jana, not even 2 years old. They lived just outside Pope Air Force Base in a quiet suburban home. But behind the scenes, the Eastburns were preparing for a big change. Gary had been assigned to a new position with the Royal Air Force in England. The whole family would be moving overseas within weeks. In the midst of the chaos of relocation, Katie had to figure out what to do with the family dog, a beautiful English setter named Dixie. She placed a classified ad in a local paper called Beeline Grab, Bragg, offering to give the dog away to a good home. It was a simple act, an innocent ad, but it set off a chain of events that would end in unimaginable horror. On May 7th, a young Army sergeant named Timothy Hennis showed up at the Eastburn residence. He was responding to the dog ad. Hennis, who lived nearby at Fort Bragg, had a wife and a baby daughter. He claimed they wanted a dog, and Katie welcomed him inside. Hennis chatted with Katie, picked up Dixie, and left. According to him, that was the last time he ever saw her. Just a few days later, Katie stopped answering her husband's calls. By May 12th, after repeated failed attempts to reach her, a neighbor grew concerned and entered the house with a local police officer. What they found inside was beyond disturbing. Katie Eastburn and her two oldest daughters had been brutally murdered. Katie had been sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly. Her body lay in the master bedroom, stripped from the waist up, a scene of carnage and rage. 5-year-old Kara was stabbed in the chest multiple times. 3-year-old Erin was found nearby, beaten so severely that the pattern of her injuries suggested she'd been struck in the back and chest with a blunt object. The youngest child, Jana, had somehow survived. Alone, dehydrated, and covered in her own waste, she'd been in the house with the bodies for days. The town of Fayetteville was stunned. A military family, targeted and destroyed in the sanctuary of their own home. No signs of forced entry, no clear motive, just death and a city on edge. The investigation began immediately. Detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office took charge. Inside the Eastburn home, they found partial fingerprints, strands of hair, and most ominously, evidence of a failed cleanup attempt. Luminol tests revealed bloody streaks on the walls and floors. Someone had tried to erase the nightmare, but only halfway. Several items were missing from the Eastburn home. Katie's ATM card, an envelope of cash, and a small paper that listed her ATM PIN. The killer hadn't just slaughtered a family, he'd stolen from them too. Then came the tip that changed everything. On the very first night of the investigation, a janitor named Patrick Cohn approached detectives. He said he saw something strange in the early morning hours of May 10th. A tall white man wearing a knit cap, jeans, and a black members-only jacket was walking out of the Eastburn's driveway carrying a large plastic trash bag. He said the man drove off in a white Chevrolet Chevette. The description was solid enough to create a police sketch, which soon ran in local media. That same week, Timothy Hennis walked into the police station voluntarily. He said he had heard the news and wanted to clear his name. After all, he had visited the Eastburn home to pick up the dog. He figured the police might want to talk. That may have been a mistake. Hennis told detectives he'd only interacted with Katie once on May 7th when he picked up Dixie. He claimed he called her again briefly on May 9th to update her on how the dog was doing, but otherwise hadn't seen or spoken to her again. He also had an alibi. On the night of May 9th, he said he drove his wife and daughter to her parents' house, then went home after stopping for gas. But the police weren't buying it. First, his physical appearance was a near-perfect match for the composite sketch. Second, the eyewitness, Patrick Cohn, picked him out in a photo lineup. Third, the timing didn't quite add up. His former girlfriend, Nancy Mazur, told detectives Hennis had shown up at her house unexpectedly on the same night he claimed to be home alone. Then came even more red flags. Detectives learned that Katie's ATM card had been used twice after her death, once on May 10th and again early on May 11th. The total withdrawn? $200. And guess who had just been late on his rent and had a history of writing bad checks? You guessed it, Timothy Hennis. A woman who used the ATM shortly after the second withdrawal described seeing a blond man, tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket. It sounded eerily like Hennis. To top it off, Hennis had dropped off a black members-only jacket at a dry cleaner on May 10th, just hours after the suspected time of the killings. Even more suspicious, neighbors said he saw him burning items in a barrel behind his house the very next day. With mounting circumstantial evidence and a witness ID, police arrested Timothy Hennis on May 15, 1985. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree rape. But as shocking as the arrest was, the trial that followed would be even more explosive. Hennis's trial began in the summer of 1986 in Cumberland County. It was a media circus, with journalists packing the courtroom and locals debating his guilt daily. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They claimed Hennis had seen Katie alone and vulnerable when he came to pick up the dog, that he was infatuated, possibly obsessed, that he returned a few nights later, on May 9th, hoping to seduce her. But when she rejected him, prosecutors said he snapped. They argued he raped Katie, then murdered her in a fit of rage, then turned his violence on the children to eliminate witnesses. The prosecution leaned hard on the timeline, the ATM withdrawals, and Cohn's eyewitness testimony. They also reminded the jury that Hennis had cleaned and burned potential evidence. His jacket, dry cleaned. The trash, burned. To seal their case, the prosecution showed the jury graphic crime scene photos. Katie's lifeless body, the stab wounds, the children's injuries. Jurors were visibly shaken. One even reportedly cried. After 10 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Guilty on all counts. On July 8, 1986, Timothy Hennis was sentenced to death. That same day, an anonymous letter was mailed to both Hennis and the sheriff's office. It read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." No return address, no fingerprints, nothing to prove it was real. To the public, it seemed like a hoax. To Hennis, it was a taunt from someone who might have gotten away with murder. But it wouldn't be the last twist in this case. While Hennis sat on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, his legal team went to work. Led by attorney Gerald Beaver, the defense appealed the conviction on one major point, that the graphic crime scene photos shown in court had unduly prejudiced the jury. They argued the images were so gruesome, so emotionally manipulative, that they made a fair trial impossible. In April 1989, Timothy Hennis returned to court. This time the defense came loaded with counterattacks. They discredited Patrick Cohn, pointing out his criminal behavior since the first trial, including multiple thefts and arrests. They also challenged the weather he claimed to have witnessed the suspect in. Cohn said it was clear, but meteorological experts said it was overcast and rainy. The female ATM witness? Her story had changed between interviews. At first, she couldn't positively identify Hennis. Then, days before the trial, she said it was him. The defense introduced new witnesses too. A teenager who was jogging near the Eastburn home that night and looked eerily similar to Hennis. A newspaper delivery woman who saw a different man with long hair near the house. They also presented evidence that several hairs, blood samples, and even footprints at the crime scene didn't match Hennis or the victims. And in a bold move, Hennis took the stand himself. For 3 weeks, the court listened, watched, and reconsidered the man they once sentenced to die. This time the jury came back with a different verdict: not guilty. Timothy Hennis walked free in April 1989. He returned to his family, re-enlisted in the U.S. Army, and began the process of rebuilding his life. But the story was far from over, because what no one knew then was that the deadliest blow was still waiting. In 2010, more than 20 years after the original crime, Timothy Hennis once again found himself in a courtroom, but this time it was different. This wasn't a civilian trial. This time it was the United States Army that had unfinished business with him. Hennis had retired honorably in 2004, but the military hadn't forgotten. Because he was technically still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, they recalled him to active duty, not to serve the country, but to face court-martial for the Eastburn murders. That's right, after being acquitted in 1989, Hennis was now facing a third trial, and this one had teeth. And the evidence that doomed him? The DNA. The very same semen sample taken in 1985 was retested in the early 2000s using new technology. It matched only Hennis. No room for error. No ambiguous fingerprints. This was biological proof, and it hit like a freight train. In court, the prosecution was ruthless. They laid out the brutal nature of the crime again, showing crime scene photos, recounting Michelle's desperate attempts to protect her daughters, and emphasizing the indisputable DNA match. Hennis's defense tried to punch holes in the timeline. They argued contamination, mishandling of evidence, and alternative suspects. But it was a hard sell. In 2010, juries believed DNA the way people once believed a signed confession. It was the gold standard. And on April 8, 2010, the verdict was handed down: guilty. A military panel sentenced Master Sergeant Timothy Hennis to death. The twist? This was a federal military trial, and the state of North Carolina had already abolished capital punishment in practice. But the military? It still had the death penalty. It was a stunning conclusion to a case that had already seen one man convicted, then exonerated, only to be condemned again years later. Hennis was now sitting on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the few inmates in modern U.S. history to be sentenced to death by a military court. And just like that, a man who once walked free became one of the most controversial inmates on death row. But the questions didn't end there. The 2010 conviction sent shockwaves across the legal world, not just because Hennis had been convicted again, but how it happened. To many, it looked like a blatant violation of double jeopardy protections. After all, wasn't he already acquitted back in 1989? The loophole? Dual sovereignty. Under U.S. law, separate sovereigns, like the state of North Carolina and the U.S. military, can each prosecute the same crime. It's rare, and usually only used in extreme cases. But in Hennis's case, it was weaponized in full. Civilian courts had cleared him, but the Army argued it had independent jurisdiction, especially since Hennis had been an active duty soldier at the time of the murders. It was enough to legally bring him back to trial. Whether it was ethical or not was a different story. Legal scholars were split. Some called it a necessary use of military justice, pointing to the strength of the DNA evidence. Others argued it set a dangerous precedent, one where a person could be hunted down by any court that didn't like the outcome of a trial. And then there were the public reactions. Some people celebrated the conviction. They saw Hennis as a brutal killer who had finally been brought to justice. Others saw it as a terrifying abuse of power. A man tried 3 times for the same crime, with the government bending the rules to get the result it wanted. What made it even murkier was that no new evidence beyond the DNA was ever presented. There were no new eyewitnesses, no confession, just a sample collected over 25 years earlier. Had the system corrected a historic wrong or created a new one? Either way, the damage was done. And the Eastburn family? They had lived with this nightmare for decades. Now they could finally close the book, or so they hoped. Today, Timothy Hennis sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, one of the most secure military prisons in the world. But here's the thing. No U.S. military execution has taken place since 1961. The death penalty exists on paper, but in practice, it's a ghost. President George W. Bush approved Hennis's execution in 2010, but no date has ever been set. So Hennis sits and waits. He's still allowed visits. He's still considered a prisoner under military law. But there's no parole, no appeals left that could overturn the conviction. His fate now rests in the hands of history. Occasionally, his case makes waves online. Reddit threads, true crime podcasts, legal forums. People are still trying to unpack it. Was he guilty? Did the military cheat the Constitution? Or did justice finally catch up to a killer who slipped through the cracks? His name comes up every time people debate DNA's role in courtrooms. Every time someone argues the fairness of dual sovereignty. Every time a wrongful conviction is brought up. He's a ghost that won't go away, either as a victim of government overreach or as a monster finally exposed. And somewhere out there, the Eastburn family still carries the scars. One brutal night, 3 lives lost, and a legal saga that outlived them all. The case of Timothy Hennis reads like a legal thriller. 3 trials, 1 man, a DNA twist decades later, and a conviction that sparked national debate. At the center of it all is a simple, painful question. Did he do it? If he didn't, then the government bent the rules to execute an innocent man. If he did, then the system let a killer walk free for over 20 years. It's a lose-lose for faith in justice, either way. Hennis's story isn't just about murder. It's about the fragility of truth, the power of new technology, and the gaps in a legal system that can try you until it gets it right. And maybe the most haunting part? We may never really know the full truth. So next time you hear about a conviction, an acquittal, or a DNA match from decades ago, remember Timothy Hennis. Because sometimes justice takes the long road, and sometimes it just keeps circling back. If you were on the jury, would you have voted to convict Hennis in 2010? Drop your opinion in the comments. Want more shocking cases where the justice system got twisted? Hit the like button and subscribe to Death Row Diaries. We post deep dives just like this every week.
He was trained to save lives, decorated with medals, degrees, and trust. An officer, a healer, a man of medicine. But on a calm November morning,
Major Nidal Malik Hasan walked into a room full of American soldiers and unleashed hell. 13 dead, 32 wounded, and a question the world still struggles to answer. How does a U.S. Army psychiatrist turn into a terrorist on American soil? This is not just a story of betrayal. It's a blueprint of institutional failure, religious radicalism, and a man whose mind became a battlefield long before the first bullet was fired. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. If you want more stories like this, raw, chilling, and real, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Before he became a mass murderer, Nidal Hasan looked like the American dream in uniform. Born in Arlington, Virginia in 1970 to Palestinian immigrant parents, he seemed like any other first-generation kid trying to make it big. He went to high school in Roanoke, studied hard, and graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in biochemistry with honors. The guy was sharp, quiet, focused. But what set him apart wasn't just his academics, it was his unshakable ambition. Right after high school, Hasan joined the U.S. Army. He wasn't going in as a grunt. He had his sights higher: medicine. The military paid his way through medical school at the prestigious Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. By the early 2000s, Hasan was well on his way to becoming a full-fledged Army psychiatrist. Degrees? Check. Military training? Check. A government paycheck and total access to America's most vulnerable soldiers? Double check. From the outside, he was everything the Army could want in a medical officer. But inside, things were falling apart. During his internship and residency at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, red flags started popping up, fast and hard. He struggled to finish the program, needing 6 years for a 4-year curriculum. He was put on academic probation, needed counseling, and required extra supervision. But no matter how shaky his performance, he kept climbing. Why? Simple. The system was overworked and undercritical. The Army needed mental health professionals. Hasan had credentials, so they pushed him through. Behind the credentials, though, there was something darker brewing. As his career progressed, Hasan's beliefs grew more intense and more dangerous. Colleagues began noticing anti-American statements. One remembered him reacting strongly to news of a Muslim man killing 2 Army recruiters in Little Rock. To most, it was a tragedy. To Hasan, it was a sign, a message. He began saying Muslims should stand up and fight against the aggressor, referring to American troops. Let that sink in. An Army psychiatrist speaking about fighting his own comrades. But it didn't stop there. During a senior year presentation at Walter Reed, Hasan delivered a slideshow titled "The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military." It wasn't a medical talk, it was a warning. He argued the Department of Defense should allow Muslim soldiers to become conscientious objectors. Why? Because forcing them to fight other Muslims would lead to adverse events, a phrase he casually explained as including refusal to deploy, espionage, or killing fellow soldiers. Wait, what? He literally predicted what he would later do, and still no one stopped him. Some called him strange. Some thought he was just devout, but no one had the courage or clarity to pull the plug. In May 2009, despite all these red flags, Nidal Hasan was promoted to Major. 2 months later, he was transferred to Fort Hood, Texas. The move was meant to give him a fresh start. What it gave him was a new stage and his final opportunity to snap. This isn't the first time red flags were ignored with deadly consequences. What would you have done if Hasan were your colleague? Let us know in the comments, and keep watching because this story only gets darker. Around the same time Hasan was giving unsettling presentations and ranting about Muslims in the military, he began reaching out to someone truly dangerous. That someone was Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical Yemeni-American cleric known for inspiring terrorists across the globe, including the 9/11 hijackers and the Boston Marathon bombers. He emailed him at least a dozen times between late 2008 and 2009. What did he want? Spiritual guidance, moral clarity, justification. In his first message, he wrote, "I used to pray with you at the Virginia Mosque." It wasn't small talk. It was a reconnection, one that al-Awlaki welcomed. Now here's the shocking part. The FBI intercepted those emails. They read them, they reviewed them, and they did nothing. Their justification? The emails were consistent with authorized research. Because Hasan was writing a paper on Islam and military service, they brushed it off. But these emails weren't academic. Hasan asked whether killing U.S. soldiers who fought in Muslim lands was justified. He praised suicide bombers. He referenced the Quran as justification for violence. Yet the system once again let him slip through. Some FBI agents privately admitted the communications were concerning. One even said, even if he was exchanging recipes, the Bureau should have put out an alert. They didn't, and Hasan kept emailing. Anwar al-Awlaki later said Hasan told him, "I speak to you about things I never speak with anyone." To him, al-Awlaki wasn't just a religious scholar. He was a commander, a mentor, the voice in his ear whispering about martyrdom, sacrifice, and holy war. And Hasan? He was listening. By late October 2009, Hasan's deployment orders were set. He was being sent to Afghanistan. The very thing he'd been dreading. The thing he'd spent years trying to avoid. In the days before his deployment, Hasan gave away nearly everything he owned. Furniture, clothes, Qurans. Neighbors thought he was just moving, but he wasn't moving. He was preparing to die. On November 5th, 2009, Hasan showed up at the Soldier Readiness Center at Fort Hood, not with a medical kit, not with papers, but with a brand new 5.7 pistol, along with over 200 rounds of ammo. Before entering, he reportedly told another soldier, "I'm going to do good work for God." He then stepped inside and opened fire. Can you spot a killer before they act? Or are we always one step too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're still watching, make sure to subscribe. You won't believe what happens next. November 5th, 2009. The sun had barely risen over Fort Hood, Texas. Soldiers gathered at the Soldier Readiness Center, lining up for last-minute medical and deployment paperwork. It was routine, predictable, safe. Then Major Nidal Hasan stepped inside. He wasn't there to heal anyone. He wasn't there to say goodbye. He was there to kill. Without hesitation, Hasan reportedly shouted, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," and pulled out a semi-automatic FN-57 pistol, along with a .357 revolver. His first shots landed in the chest of an unarmed soldier standing just a few feet away. Then chaos exploded. Soldiers ducked behind tables, others ran for exits. Some froze in place, stunned that the man holding the gun was one of their own. Hasan moved methodically, reloading over and over again, targeting soldiers and civilians alike. Witnesses later said he appeared calm, almost robotic. One compared his movements to someone at the gun range, controlled, focused, unshaken. He shot 13 people dead and wounded over 32 more, many of whom were hit while trying to help others. One victim had just returned from Iraq. Another was a pregnant mother. The massacre lasted around 10 minutes, an eternity in that hellish room. The killing spree finally ended when Department of the Army police officer Kimberly Munley arrived. She exchanged fire with Hasan, but was shot 3 times, including a wound to her leg. Moments later, her partner, Sergeant Mark Todd, confronted Hasan and shot him multiple times, paralyzing him from the waist down. Hasan collapsed, bleeding, but alive. The shooter was no longer anonymous. He was Major Nidal Malik Hasan, United States Army Medical Corps. The military and the entire nation stood in stunned silence. An American soldier had waged war against his own. After the dust settled, the question wasn't, did he do it? The question was, why? Hasan didn't hide. He didn't run. He didn't lawyer up and claim insanity. At least not how most defendants do. Instead, from his hospital bed, he remained silent, paralyzed, unapologetic. He was charged with 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, making him eligible for the death penalty. The trial was expected to be swift. It was anything but. In court, Hasan stunned everyone by announcing that he would represent himself. No legal team, no defense strategy, no witnesses. He fired his civilian lawyer, retired Army JAG officer John Galligan, and told the judge he didn't want to fight the charges because, in his words, he was not a criminal. He was a soldier fighting for Islam. During opening arguments, Hasan admitted everything. He said, "I am the shooter. The evidence will clearly show I was the shooter." Then came his most chilling declaration yet. "I switched sides. I am now a mujahideen." The courtroom froze. This wasn't a man trying to save his life. This was a man justifying mass murder in the name of faith. And while Hasan barely spoke during the proceedings, he made sure his silence screamed. He refused to cross-examine witnesses. He didn't present any evidence in his defense. He didn't even call a single witness, not one. His strategy wasn't incompetence, it was intentional martyrdom. At one point, the court-appointed legal team begged the judge to let them take over, claiming Hasan was deliberately helping the prosecution give him the death penalty. They said it violated their ethics to continue assisting him. The judge refused. Hasan remained in charge. Over 11 days, nearly 90 witnesses testified against him. Some wept, others glared at him with hatred. All of them identified Hasan as the man who destroyed their lives. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case: forensic evidence, ballistics, survivor testimony, even Hasan's own chilling confession. But Hasan just sat there, silent, detached, in his wheelchair, as though he was already gone. When it came time for closing arguments, Hasan declined to speak. He offered no final plea. He was done talking. On August 28, 2013, the military jury unanimously sentenced Nidal Hasan to death. They also stripped him of his pay, rank, and military status, everything. He is now known only as inmate Nidal Hasan, currently housed at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the only maximum security military prison in America. But even behind bars, Hasan never softened. In 2014, just months after the sentence, Hasan wrote a letter to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS at the time. In it, he requested full citizenship in the Islamic State and signed the letter with 3 letters: SOA, Soldier of Allah. Let that sink in. He committed mass murder, paralyzed himself, lost everything, and still he clung to the ideology that led him there. Hasan has never apologized, never expressed remorse, never asked for mercy. He once told mental health examiners that being executed would make him a martyr and that he welcomed it. His time in prison hasn't been without controversy either. A long-standing legal battle surrounded his beard, which he began growing after the attack as a symbol of faith. The court repeatedly ordered it shaved to comply with military regulations, but Hasan resisted, claiming religious rights. Eventually, prison authorities forcibly shaved it off, igniting a wave of lawsuits and outrage from his former lawyer. Still, Hasan sits on death row, still paralyzed, still defiant. And while the military justice system sentenced him to die, he's still alive over 15 years later, awaiting the outcome of the slow, grinding appeals process. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the Nidal Hasan story is how preventable it was. The warning signs were everywhere. Doctors flagged him for erratic behavior. Supervisors criticized his performance. Peers raised alarms about his radical views. And still, he was promoted. He gave public presentations predicting Muslim soldiers might kill their comrades. He emailed a known terrorist cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, and the FBI read those emails, but they let him go. After the massacre, the Senate Homeland Security Committee launched an investigation. Their report called Fort Hood the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. But what truly stung was their conclusion. The attack was preventable. They blamed political correctness, bureaucratic failure, and an unwillingness to confront religious radicalism in the ranks. Even the Army Chief of Staff, General George Casey, made a controversial statement days after the massacre. It would be a greater tragedy if diversity became a casualty of this event. Many were furious. The lives of 13 soldiers had just been taken, and the top brass seemed more concerned with optics than accountability. The truth? The system protected Hasan. For years, it shielded him behind a uniform and a title. It looked the other way when he spiraled. It gave him medals and rank until it was too late. Nidal Hasan was trusted, educated, promoted, saluted, and yet, on one blood-soaked day in 2009, he shattered that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. He killed 13 of his fellow soldiers and wounded over 30 more, not in combat, not on foreign soil, but right here at home on a U.S. military base. And he did it not for personal gain, but for ideology, for a belief so extreme, so dangerous, that it turned a healer into a killer. Now Hasan sits in silence, no regrets, no repentance, just waiting for the day when the state decides it's time for him to die. But the scars he left behind, on survivors, on families, on the American military, will never fade. He wanted to be a martyr. Instead, he became a warning. If this story chilled you, share it. Spread the truth. Subscribe to Death Row Diaries for more disturbing deep dives into America's most dangerous killers. And let us know in the comments, should Nidal Hasan be executed, or is living with what he did the ultimate punishment?